Welcome and good morning. Today is the follow up presentation on four pillars of self mastery. Self mastery is essential to leading. I often call it personal leadership, but it's also self mastery, and we should have self mastery before we are leading others. Unfortunately, sometimes it's most of the times it's on the job training. So my dynamic leadership model uses self mastery as a foundation because we have to move and flow with whatever's coming at us. That's what emotional intelligence tells us as well. The difference is that emotional intelligence, and this is not a knock on that at all. Uh, it's it's very much a viable model and discipline. But what happens is it tends to go deep into how the parts of the brain, and that's not actionable. What I'm talking about today, the four pillars of self mastery, my objective is to be not only very actionable, but accessible to anyone. And more importantly, so that it works on a bad day of a bad week. Even in chaos, we want to make sure that it works. Now, to set this up, the four pillars, what I'm doing with that is I look at stability, and I often use a model of three, but also using four legs on a table is stability. So three gives me flexibility, but four gives me stability. And because I want it to be a foundation, that's why I'm using the four pillars. Now, it's not what we're talking about is not motivation. It's not about, hey, here's a hack or a quick fix or here's something that'll work today, the latest buzz. This is a life-changing model that you can use today and forever. And it's a progressive one. You can actually apply it today, but it's going to take a while. The word mastery suggests that it takes a while because we have to embrace it. And I'll show some slides that illustrate that as we go through here. Again, though, three legs work fine, but under pressure, you've got some risks. And for example, you can see how the one leg can easily tip over. Three legs, it's while it's secure, it can be stable as long as it's balanced. It's going to be okay. But when you get knocked off balance, and that's why I want something that works with chaos and even on a bad day of a bad week, and regardless of what's going on around you. Because in order to lead others, we have to be centered, and we want to get to the point where no matter what happens externally, we are responding from our stronger internal frame. So these are the four pillars: knowledge, habit mastery, state mastery, and forgiveness. And I do them in very specific order. One, we have to have enough knowledge to make the case to go to the next step. Habit mastery, because if we don't believe that we can actually control, change, modify, and live into our habits, then it makes the state mastery something that's just aspirational and not actual. Once we understand the habit mastery and the DNA, the anatomy of a habit, it makes state mastery more accessible. And then again, we can operate with this just fine, but forgiveness is also important. We have to forgive ourselves and we have to forgive others because we don't want access to old emotional states or old emotional noise that can easily come up. And when you're interacting with other people, you never know where that next trigger is going to come from. Now, self mastery is not personality change, it's system reliability. And that's where we're going after. Here's the knowledge slide. It's you can see orientation. That orientation is important, and I was alluding to that with talking about dynamic leadership because we can understand what we're supposed to do, but as the environment changes, we have to adjust that, and we have to adjust. So when I talk about leading others, you'll see when we get into February, I talk about leadership as a one-to-one, and this is at the front line. You may have 6 to 10 people reporting to you, but if you think of leadership as a one-to-one, it makes sense because you're meeting people where they are and then leading them to where they want to be and where you want them to be. And eventually that group will become a collective, can be treated like a collective. But initially, especially initially, those are six, seven, eight, nine, or 10 individuals that you're meeting where they are and then bringing them to where they want to go. The other part about knowledge is that a confused mind doesn't act. We know this. And marketing people will tell you this all day long. Knowledge is about orientation more so than intelligence. And there's a big thing of insight. Insight really does help. It helps move the needle. But while insight is better, much better than what I would say is a hack, the hacks tend to have a very short life. And the reason they have a very short life is because you're trying to change something that's large and made up of many, many elements, and you're trying to make a change at the summary level when the change has to happen at the element level. And by having a hack, it influences the summary for a moment, but the elements are still the same. And so you go back to what was. That hopefully that makes sense. We'll get into it a little bit more. So you may be familiar with my work around the 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. Now these first 4 are internal. These involve just us, right? They don't involve other people. And as you get to the next 2, relationships and professional, other people are now involved. So while we may have agency here on our own, once you involve other people, your outcomes are not as reliable. Your input output sequence is not always going to give you the same outputs because other people are involved. So here, yeah, you can get to the point where you can execute perfectly every time. Here, when you add in this, you can execute perfectly and still miss the mark. And this is, again, back to leadership. You have to adjust. You have to recognize what you're seeing. I used to talk about in sales training, it's like having a flip chart and you're drawing a picture on the flip chart and you see that the prospect doesn't really like that picture. You rip it off and say, well, you know what, we can make that better. Let's look at this picture. And that's not what you're actually doing. It's the mental imagery that you have as you go through your presentation so that you can adjust real time as you're recognizing signals from the person that maybe what you're saying is not landing. And then the next one is interesting because in my 7 performance areas, I call it financial, but I also like to look at it as the outcome because financial is a conduit to something else. I don't want to look at financial as the end goal. While it's stated that way, I want to make this much money, and then people die on their deathbed. They wish they had this and that and the other. The financial goal in and of itself is not enough. This is why we talk about starting with purpose. This has to be something with meaning, something that's bigger than yourself. And so I look at what is the outcome that you want from the financial. What is that financial strength going to give you? And it's not just another framework. This is a diagnostic dashboard. Yes, it is my entry into how to get agency because you first have to master these 4 to have agency, and then you have to master your ability to adjust so that you continue with agency no matter what's going on around you. But it's also a dashboard because as I'm working with a client, I can instantly see where their breakdown is. Each one of these can become a weak link and we have to build on it. This is why development is iterative, refinement is iterative, and a lot of your A players are used to having inputs and defined outputs happening automatically. And when they get into what I'll call trial and error, it gets disorienting because they feel like they're failing. And of course, obviously, people who have achieved success have gotten over that hurdle. Success, the definition of success is the progressive realization of predetermined worthwhile personal goals. So that progressive realization suggests that there's room for this iterative refinement. And as you're going through trial and error, it's useful to remember that. So the next one, knowledge, as I leave knowledge, it's to know and not do is to not know. So right, we could know this, but without living it and experiencing it, you it's just knowledge. It's maybe insight. So what we do is we literally work through the 7 areas, and in the workshop we'll tie them to a quest. So you start with a quest, then we apply each of these to that quest, and the quest is something small enough that it's not overwhelming. You can actually make decisions right there in the workshop, so you can experience each one. And then later in the workshop, we turn that quest into an on ramp, and that on ramp is to your 10x. Now, if I start with 10x, it's like I can't do 10x. That's not possible. That's the whole point of self mastery. We want to get to the point where when I say 10x, you say, "Yeah, I'd like to see that. Let's do it," because you already understand that it's a process to get there. So now the next one is habit mastery, and this is what I'm alluding to. When you understand the anatomy of a habit and you understand that your personality is really a collection of elements that lead to that personality, and you can't change your personality from the personality side because personality is a summary. You have to change it from the element side, but people continue to try to change it from the construct, from the summary. Same thing with confidence. You want more confidence? You can act more confidently, and that will help. But the better way to get confidence is change it at the elements level. So what we're talking about with habit mastery is how to change things at the elements level, and this gets to conditioning. And then when you're talking about conditioning, you're also bringing in automaticity, and that's because, well, for a number of reasons. But one is the network of neurons where habits reside. That processes at 11 million bits per second. The conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second. If you want mastery, you have to understand the automaticity part of it, or the automaticity is always going to be have have power over the conscious mind, because the conscious mind is barely a blip when you think about 11 million bits per second versus 50 bits per second. So I would say most people attempt to change habits in the wrong phase after the system is already decided. Now, atomic habits gets close because it talks about the cue, and then how the cue leads to your response. But it's the gap in between the cue and the response, that half second period of time that happens thousands of times a day, that is responsible for changing your life. Willpower works to a degree, but not in chaos. And willpower is not going to work when you get tired, it wanes with decisions. So you've heard of a decision fatigue. Willpower reduces there. And also something that people don't think about is that willpower triggers I don't want power. So they're both, to use emotional intelligence language, they're both in the prefrontal cortex. And that prefrontal cortex was formed around age 27, but from 19 to 27. And there's 20 billion neurons. So 1/5, 20% of our neurons exist in the prefrontal cortex. And that wasn't there at age 18. So the willpower you had access to at age 18 is not the same willpower you have access to at age 27. While it may be the same technically, the challenge is you also have introduced something called I don't want power, because willpower triggers that I don't want power because contextually they bring each other in, and right, and then habits are associations. So we've got to get the control over the associations so that we recognize I don't want power for what it is, keep it in its rightful place. So the association of I don't want power is not strong enough to hurt you on the willpower side. And here's a quick model of what's going on. So this is part from my 7-step reset, which I'll get into in a little bit more depth. But this step 2 is your operationally calm state. And then step 4 is your conscious mind response. In between those two is the stimulus that happens thousands of times a day. You'll see online that it says 33,000 times a day we're making a decision. And those decisions are stimulus response cycles for the most part. In each one of those stimulus response cycles, there's a pre-listening period, because the pre-listening period is constant. So it's pre-listening, and then a stimulus comes up and it goes into here. So this would be 0. This is T minus a tenth of a second. And this first quarter of a second, that's your reaction time. So the subconscious is not just sitting there doing nothing. It's actually processing. It's looking at cognitive biases, or applying cognitive biases, is looking at heuristics that are already existing, like meta programs, bundled up programs. If there's something you do all the time, that becomes a bundle of associations, if you will. So that, you heard neurons that fire together wire together. So we think about this as a bundling. And so some of those meta programs are executed right here. This is where the network of neurons are starting to look at the path of least resistance. This is why habits are what they are, because that path of least resistance is the well myelinated high synapse pathway. Those highly myelinated pathways are the path of least resistance, which is why you don't change habits, you build a new one. And that new habit, while it doesn't demyelinate the old habit, what it does do is the synapse that's connecting those neurons moves to the new habit. That's called synaptogenesis. It's like a pruning. So it prunes the unused neural pathways and applies the synapse to the active neural pathways. And that's where you get the new neural pathway, which replaces the old habit. Now, the next thing you have after that, so this is like the initial detection and getting things ready, then this is the reaction assembly. This is this half second is where all of the power resides, or most of the power resides. Because once this reaction is done, it feels like truth. The reason it feels like truth is because you got 11 million bits per second processing. You cross this line over into where it's handing off to the conscious mind. That reaction is going to feel like truth because it's packaged. It took a neuron signal, it took a neural pathway set of signals and turned it into a construct, a summary that can be perceived by the conscious mind. That summary is what we see as truth, it's idea, and this is why we people think that it's their own thought. It's coming from a mind. It's coming from their mind, and they defend it. Sometimes a person gets triggered into something, and they'll spend the next few hours, defending why that choice was made when really it had to do with an association that may have been set 20 or 30 years ago. So this is important to understand what a reaction is. And there's things that we can do, fortunately, in this space. While this space may only represent a few milliseconds, you can expand it. You can expand it with a conditioned pause. This is the automaticity. We can literally, you're not necessarily installing a pause as much as you are installing a set of criteria. Think of it like a prompt with ChatGPT. You can install a conditioned prompt where before the reaction happens, it converts it to something that's more useful than just a summary. It's a summary with some bullet points to it, so to speak, or a summary with some perspective. The other thing we do here is the subconscious or the network of neurons is biased towards looking for threats. So, and this is not scientific, but I would say that roughly 80% of the stimuli that people come across are perceived as a threat by the network of neurons. That's a problem because threats are not like a dimmer switch to the subconscious or the network of neurons. And I use subconscious and network of neurons interchangeably. I prefer network of neurons, but people don't use that terminology is not common. But what I will not do is call it a mind because it's not a mind. So that subconscious is biased towards looking, assuming a threat or danger. And if that's happening 80% of the time, you can see why we're chasing things. You can see why our reactions are what they are. You can see why people who are getting triggered are being triggered because they're freaking out over something. But if you consider that fight or flight, the cortisol, the adrenaline that happens from all of that, it's designed for a tiger on the Serengeti, proverbially. Most of us are not encountering tigers at all in our lifetime, not face to face. And if you think about a tiger level threat, yes, if you've been in combat, you've had tiger level threats, obviously. And this is why in special forces, rangers, special ops, that system is changed. So we do that same kind of thing here with what's called a positivity exercise. So we change the subconscious so that instead of assuming that 80% of the stimuli that come through is a threat, we change it to something more like 20%. Again, that's not a scientific measure, but just in terms of the experience that people have, you can see the calm. You can see that they're just not threatened. So that 33,000 times per day, guess what? It starts to get reduced because one, all the stimuli that come up are not getting represented. They're not getting into this assembly phase. They're just ignored because they don't matter. And even the ones that are brought in, if it's not a threat, it's brought in as a much lower level, which means we're not being triggered, etc. So a lot of it is this power right here that is the reaction piece. It's interesting, especially in talking with people who are 50 and over, how we have figured out ways to describe this. People say I'm out of control, something else took control of me. It's like, yeah, I mean, I was outside of myself, or there's nothing I can do about it. It's just who I am. They've reconciled this thing and they've accepted it, and it's become their identity, which is another challenge because now when they're starting to think about things in the future, it's going through that filter of their identity. And if their identity is such that I'm not capable, those things are not available to me, it's going to limit what they pursue. And then you see at the bottom there associations, and the neural signal is on the left side, and conscious thought is on the right side. So that line that crosses, and I could move that line to the left. It's just depend because it's a process. It's handing off as a process. The conscious mind has a reaction time of about a half second. The subconscious has a reaction time of a quarter second. But I already said that that first quarter second is actually starting to uh, perceive what's going on, and even before that, it was doing a pre-listening. And what I like to think about is instead of letting the conscious mind fully engage at that half second, it's more circling. And it's only a quarter of a second. So if you think about that conscious thought line happening at 3/4 of a second, you now have a quarter of a second for the subconscious to do that handoff, as I was talking about, and positioning and packaging it in a way that we've already pre-programmed, just like doing a prompt with Chat GPT. You've already told it how you want that information to come across, and now it becomes more useful. So the next one would be the agency view. So we'll talk about the 7 steps, and steps 1 and 2 have to do with your development and your ability to access that development. Like I said, to know and not do is like not knowing, but if you can access what you know, that's what steps 1 and 2 is about, or are that's what steps 1 and 2 are about, where you are accessing the knowledge that you have so that you are in a what I'll call an operationally calm state of mind, where now you are ready, you are the best version of yourself possible for that conditioned reaction that's going to come, right? Because we said we make about 30,000 plus decisions a day. So another one is coming. We want to be operationally calm before it arrives. And then the post part of it is steps 4 through 7 include the response, emotional modulation if needed, because we want to get back to calm before we take action. And emotional modulation is not always going to be needed. And in fact, with the positivity exercise, it'll be even less often that we're going to need that emotional modulation. And then we have step 6 would be action, and step 7 is returning to mindfulness or that operationally calm state, right? So that we are prepared. This is an agency view. This is where you have agency because each conditioned reaction, you're approaching it from the best version of yourself. This is why by default you will have fewer than that number, whatever it is. If it's 33,000, I would say maybe 5,000. So it doesn't really change the fact that 95% of our lives are run by habit. But what it does change is how many stimuli we're reacting to. And this model keeps you from reacting, which is in step 3, and it enables responding, which begins with step 4. And this is what happens when people are triggered. Steps 1 and 2 and steps 4 through 7 get blocked out, and they just go from conditioned reaction to conditioned reaction to conditioned reaction. So, in other words, the reaction here becomes the stimulus for the next conditioned reaction. That stimulus becomes the stimulus for the next conditioned reaction. And you can see this when you're watching a video of somebody who's triggered into that state, and they're just spiraling upward and or downward, right? And you can see that they're not in control of that it's something that's going on without them being involved. Now this is I think a powerful slide, because when I talk to people about neurons, network of neurons versus the mind, and I say the subconscious is not a mind, and I say things like the personality is a collection of the behaviors, a lot of times I'll see the eyes glass over. I very seldom see people deny it. In fact, I almost never do, because there's enough information out there that people are starting to knock on this door. What's interesting is taking a long time to cross that line. So, for example, you'll see somebody say, "Oh, yeah, that changed their brain chemistry." Well, what are they really saying? They're saying that their associations have been altered. That's neuroplasticity. Now, how do you get to neuroplasticity? That's deep practice, and we'll talk about that. But just the fact that somebody's saying that changed their brain chemistry, it tells you that they're seeing the distinction of elements and neurons versus the mind and constructs. So let's look at something that everybody understands: physical skill. If I mentioned something like muscle memory, most people would say, yeah, I know what muscle memory is, and they would describe it. Now, they may not describe it the same way that I would, but I would say that muscle memory is not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. And what we're doing is we're changing the way that the neural pathways interact with one another to achieve this outcome. I would say I could go on and say it involves acetylcholine, which is the signal from the neural pathway to the muscle junction. It includes the neurotransmitter glutamate, which is from the central nervous system to the neural pathway. I could say it includes dopamine, which is like a signal amplifier. So the more you practice something, the stronger that signal becomes, which makes that move the path of least resistance. It makes it dominant, and you get that result even in chaos. So people understand that even if I said that, while you may not describe it that way, it would be hard to disagree with it. You could look up the terms, right? If those are new terms for you, but you would come to that same conclusion. As I go up the line, we talk about physiology. I can tell somebody that if they're hungover, they've got their head down, and they're feeling sort of depressed, that's going to lead to a feeling of maybe not depression, but a lower energy level, right? I can talk about if somebody's smiling, they might lead to being more happy. So these things, people understand that when I'm talking about the elements of like having my head down or smiling, leading to or leading to mood, we can see that. We can see that those pieces. But if I talk about the mood itself, the mood is a construct. The mood is a summary. So if a person says I'm depressed, and then they go in and let me not use depression. This is not mental health. This is not mental health at all. This is about helping leaders access what they know. It's about leveraging emotional intelligence to be the best version of yourself in that leadership role, no matter what kind of chaos is going around. But so if you said that I want to have more presence, presence is a summary. What does presence look like? Well, it has to do with eye contact. You can see that. Those are the elements. It has to do with eye contact. It has to do with posture. It has to do with your breathing. It has to do with your pausing and your cadence, right? Whatever you want to add, you can see there's elements there, but to change presence at the presence level would be very difficult. So I can go up this scale and keep giving that example, and then we get here to identity. Now, identity is a summary, it's a construct. What are the elements that go into identity? Okay, now it starts to get maybe a blank stare, right? What are the elements that go? Well, guess what? Identity is a summary and a just like muscle memory is an identity is a summary and a construct. Just like personality is a summary and a construct. So what we're doing in this process of understanding habit mastery is we are taking charge of the constructs by changing the elements. The elements are changed at the neuron level. The constructs have to do with that handoff from the neural pathway side over to the mind. Remember, I said we're going from 11 million bits per second processing over to a mind, a structure, a construct, a summary that the mind can perceive as thought. So the next one is state, because in order to do what we're talking about consistently, we have to also be able to manage state. Now, this is where knowing and doing either connect or they fall apart. So if I know how to do something, but under pressure I can't do it, well, that's a problem, because that means we don't really know what we're going to get. If you have somebody who's operating well within their comfort zone, you know that it's going to be pretty reliable, even when there's external factors coming in. So mastery is the difference between knowing and accessing. We could call it that way. And real-time agency requires state mastery. Now, as I was talking about, this is another version of that other slide. Once these things collapse, you're too late. Once you're into this conditioned reaction, and you're no longer getting the response side and the pre-stimulus side, it's too late. You can't stop it. You can't suppress it, because the more you suppress it, the more you're putting attention into it. So think about it like this: if you're having a fear-based conditioned reaction, at some level, that reaction has to do with a threat, which could have to do with a perception of life and death. You're not going to overcome that desire to be alive in that moment. It's going to always become stronger than whatever suppression you can put on it. So don't try to suppress it. What we want to do is slow down. You want to slow down, just back off, right? Do some deep breathing, take a walk. And I'm talking even a 1 minute walk. Even if you can, go out of the room. You can be on the phone if you're using a headset. You can walk out of the room, and that's enough to change your frame and just pause, right? Take a breath. 2 seconds is nothing in terms of having a conversation with somebody, but 2 seconds is a massive amount of time when it comes to slowing things down and getting back to a calm state. But you have to do it within the first, I would say, 90 seconds of a triggering event or an anxiety spiral kind of thing, because once that first 90 seconds goes by, it starts to become a neurobiological event. You have the cortisol coming in, and other associations are coming in, and it starts to get out of control. So you don't stop reactions, you slow down what's coming next. And that's here's the 7 step reset. You can see you have the 7 steps. This is step 3, where we've been talking about. These are the 1 and 2, the knowledge, and then your access to that knowledge. And then these are the, and this is like state. What physical, spiritual, emotional state are you in? What's your self-image look like? And you can find these presentations out on 7stepreset.com/live. I have a presentation for most of the steps. And then you have the response side. As I mentioned, you have response, emotional modulation if needed, because we don't want to be acting on that response if we're emotionally triggered. We want to get that back to calm. That's about a 90 seconds if needed. Not always needed, and it's not always 90 seconds. You could actually get there with practice. You'll get there in a few seconds. You can emotionally modulate in just a few seconds once you practice this. And then here's the return to mindfulness. So here's that slide again. You can see what we want to have is self-regulation in that steps 1 and 2, and we want to have response, action, and mindfulness over here to 4 to 7, and that's happening multiple times a day. And there's another picture of it, same thing. I have 33,000 times a day, but just think of it as, so if you're awake 65,000 seconds, you're looking at perhaps a stimulus response cycle every other second. Let's see what's going on here. And this is a summary view. So this is what we've been talking about. Step 3, conditioned reaction and handoffs to the conscious mind. And now we have the 7 phases of stimulus response. So this is not that different. Hold on. This is not that different from the slide that we looked at before. But I wanted to show you the 7 phases. This is that pre-listening period. It can be T minus 100th of a second. Here's the stimulus. And then you have your initial detection, your rapid appraisal, and your reaction formation. You don't really need to know this and understand this. I don't want to get into that path of the amygdala and the hippocampus, but this is what emotional intelligence is describing as it talks about things handing off. This is what's going on. The reason I bring it up is because I want to highlight this space here where the network of neurons is handing off to the preconscious the conscious mind. So it says preconscious surfacing, and then it becomes the conscious engagement, and that leads to a consolidation and action on the subconscious side, right? And so that action becomes, here's the recommended response. And this is where I say we can use the same kind of capabilities that we have over here, because we've got the access to the reticular activating system. We can use that same kind of capability to formulate the recommendation for the response to something that's more useful and productive, aligned with our quest and life design. Now, and you looking at it when a person is triggered, it looks more like this. So you have, and it's not always a second. These numbers obviously move around. And I would say 3/4 of a second to a second is realistic in an agency model. But as you get under stress, you now have a tighter. So these start to collapse, right? You start to see maybe this one will collapse, this one will collapse. The conscious mind side collapses, especially as the reaction becomes the response. If you're letting your reaction become the response, this is that collapse. This is why people say you need to have a pause. But that pause that you're attempting to do is after the reaction. Once the reaction happens, it's very difficult to go back the other way. So you're trying to pause, but this life and death energy is coming in saying, no, we got to keep going. We got to do this. We have to hyper, hyper, hyper. And you don't get to pause. By slowing it down before what comes next, by interrupting, this is what they mean by interrupting the pattern. You literally change your frame. You go look out the window. You take a pause. You say, I need to check on something. You take a breath. You What I recommend doing is on a regular basis anchor in a calm state. I've done this with box breathing while walking. Right now, I do it with 10-minute breathing exercise every morning. 10 minutes of inhales at 15 seconds and exhales at 15 seconds. So 4 breaths a minute. I do that for 10 minutes. And I worked up to it. I started with 5 seconds and worked up to 15. And it's not difficult if you just work up. That's actually applying deep practice. But what it does for me is it anchors a state that I have every single day. And while I'm doing that, by the way, I'm not just, letting my mind wander. I'm thinking about my quest, my vision. What is it that I'm wanting to do? I'll also spend some time thinking about what's happening that day, right? What's not right yet? What do I need to work on? And that helps me tighten up whatever I have planned for that day. And the best part about it is all I have to do is take in a couple of seconds breath, and I've anchored that calm state of steps two, one, and two. And then under high triggering, you can see even the first two collapse. So while I say that the subconscious has a reaction time of 1/4 of a second, 250 milliseconds, we've seen trained athletes approach 150 milliseconds for the reaction time. So we know it's faster. If you look at somebody who's having a phobia response, a phobic response, it's probably down there in that 150 milliseconds time frame, which is going to reduce all of this. And then the subconscious, or the conscious mind, I should say, that's collapsing because it's getting this massive signal coming in that something's scary happening. So it's too late to interrupt it there. Again, we want to change it on the other side. And then we have forgiveness. I put forgiveness in here because if you go back to the seven seven model step, the seven performance areas, we know that you can do everything right, but end up getting knocked off kilter because when you bring other people in, your outcomes change. Forgiveness is not about morality, it's about having agency. What it does is provides us a filter or a barrier so that the noise from the past is not coming through and getting seat time or screen time in the present. Those relationship that relationship pain that we've had in the past is always knocking, could always be knocking on the door for attention. We don't want that to happen. And one of the ways to do it that I would say doesn't work is suppressing it, right? Because if you suppress it, you're just putting more attention on it. But if you remove them, and by removing them, you're not removing the memory, you're taking the sting and the pain out of it by forgiving yourself and forgiving others. You have to do both sides. And when you get into this conversation about forgive and forget, and I don't want to, and that person hurt me so badly, I never want to forgive them. Well, forgiving doesn't mean subjecting yourself to any more harm. What forgiveness does is it takes the resentment out of you. Right? There have been people who've been uh, who their cancer has been tracked back to just holding resentment. I'm not a doctor. I didn't do the research. I'm just saying you could find that. Go online and look at the linkage between resentment and disease. You don't even have to put in the word cancer, and you'll see examples coming up. So the forgiveness is about releasing ourselves from that negative energy so that it doesn't come up knocking on the door. Now you can still talk about it, you can still think about it. Now, what do you do with this forgive and forget thing, right? what you want to do, or one of the things you can do, is set boundaries. And boundaries can be on a continuum. You can have boundaries all the way from things I'm going to do differently. For example, I'm not going to go to that place anymore. That's a personal boundary. No one else has to be involved other than me telling them I'm not going. But that's a personal boundary. And it could be a boundary that you're putting on somebody else. You can say, I know that you want to talk about this right now, but I don't think this is a good time. I promise you I will be back here at 5 o'clock and we can have a conversation then. And that gets you out of having a conversation with somebody that you can't win, because remember, if they're triggered, they can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. They're already off and running. To have a rational conversation with somebody who's in trigger mode is not going to go anywhere. So think about it as performance hygiene, not morality. Forgiveness is not some highbrow thing that you've got to, you know, live into. It's really about taking care of yourself. And that's going to enable us to carry the agency that we've developed in the mental, physical, spiritual, emotional area and carry it through the relationships and professional so that we can get to our outcome. And then this is aligned with emotional intelligence. So the four pillars of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And dynamic leadership looks at self mastery as the entry point, because from self mastery, now I can lead one to one and I can lead one to many. So, in other words, setting the climate, which is fluid, right? And that climate leads to culture, but it also enables me to lead from one to one. The other thing it does is we get out of this space of leadership preferences. Somebody says, oh, here's how I like to lead, and here's how I like to lead. What I mean by that is, if you look at a sports team, a professional sports team, they are challenged every single week or every few days, depending on the sport. And when they're challenged by those opponents, that opponent is trying to stop their every play. So you don't get coaches saying, "Oh, well, I like this play because whatever." The plays go through this rigor of what actually works. What are the high percentage plays? This is why you see trick plays in Pee Wee football. You can go to a game and there's probably a trick play probably every game. You get into high school, there's fewer trick plays. College, there's fewer trick plays, and in the pros, there's very, very few trick plays, because trick plays don't work at the pro level because you've got too much skill there. And it's that doesn't exist with leadership. So the most persuasive person can be the one who says, this is the kind of leadership that we want to have. And now you've got a hodgepodge mixture of different leadership styles. You got this guy going with command, high high command and control, and you have this person over here being more participative. You got another person over here being democratic and etc. And you get a family oriented, and you get this hodgepodge, and then it creates a difficult culture because different people in the organization are experiencing a different version of the company, right? Because the leader is the representation of the company, and to them that is their connect point. And if they're all different, and when they get around the table talking about it, the different employees all have a different experience. It makes it harder for the vision of the company to shine through. So that's why dynamic leadership starts with self mastery, because with self mastery, your social awareness is going to be more accurate, and your relationship management will be more accurate, and you'll be focused on principles, what really works, which gets back to knowledge, because principles are what we should be focused on, not preferences when it comes to leading others. And so there's your four pillars: knowledge, habit mastery, state mastery, and forgiveness. There's your the version that shows up all of them on one slide. You take a screenshot of that if you like. And then we have the dashboard. It's serves two purposes. It's the development model, but it's also the dashboard to see where you are. And that's it. That's the four pillars. If you want to come online, I will put that link there. You can join the conversation by clicking the link that's on the screen. You probably can't click it on the screen, but it's in this. It's in the notes, in the comments, depending on what platform you're on. And I'll be doing this one more time tomorrow on LinkedIn live, and then next week. So this is the model. This is the four pillars of self mastery. I'll be talking about this all of January, but it'll be a different view. So sometimes I'll go wide, broader. Sometimes I'll go with more depth. But next week I'll focus on some of the levers that we have to make it real. I want to make it practical. So there's levers that we have as we work through the 7 performance series, which is the knowledge part of it, right? Then the habit mastery, there's levers that we have. Like I'll talk about the positivity exercise, how that works. And then state mastery, we'll talk about emotional modulation, how that works. And then forgiveness, we'll have some models that you can use to make forgiveness easier. And you can even use, we'll get into some examples of how to set boundaries. In the workshop, to make it real, we take real existing situations and help the people we walk through with the participants how to set those different boundaries. So that's it. I don't see anybody clicking on to come in, and I will be doing this 8 o'clock in the morning for the rest of January, and then February we'll get into leadership. All right. Take care. Have a great weekend.